like to turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 5. In verses 17 to 48, I'm not going to read those verses, but there begins another portion of the sermon. And in this portion or section, Christ reveals the relation of his mission to the teachings of the Old Testament. And he reveals that he did not come to do away with Old Testament teaching, did not come to overthrow its authority, but he came to fulfill, to enforce, and to fulfill Old Testament teaching. Christ never pitted the New Testament against the Old. And the Bible, the Old and New Testament, is a unit and is an agreement in all of its parts. So the law given in the Old Testament and then what we have in the New Testament are not enemies. They don't have to be reconciled because they're not enemies. In this portion of the sermon, Christ deals with a variety of subjects. He deals with the subjects of murder, verses 21 through verse 26. He deals with adultery, verses 27 through 30. He deals with divorce, verses 31 and 32. He talks about oaths, verses 33 through 37. He talks about retaliation, verses 38 through 42. And then he closes with talking about love, verses 43 through 48. In dealing with these subjects, he enlarges upon them. From what the Old Testament said, Christ enlarges upon them. And he brings more clarity to them. This is seen, there's a very definite pattern in this portion of the sermon. He introduces each subject by quoting an Old Testament scripture. In verse 21, he says, "Ye have heard," and then he quotes. Verse 27, "Ye have heard." Verse 31, "It hath been said." Verse 33, again, "Ye have heard." And then again, he just mentions a commandment or a law. Verse 38, "Ye have heard that it hath been said." And then in verse 43, "Ye have heard that it hath been said." So this is the pattern. Ye have heard, and then that is followed by the law, or the Old Testament teaching. And then that is followed by the words, "But I say unto you." And he's not contradicting anything that was said in the Old Testament. He's just taking it a little further. He's taking it further. He's taking it into the spirit of these commands. Notice verse 22. "But I say unto you." But I say unto you. Again, he talked about murder. And, "But I say unto you." And then he enlarges, he expands it. "Whosoever is angry," he includes that under this heading of murder. In verse 28, "But I say unto you," I'm talking about adultery there, "whosoever looketh He's taken it further. Verse 32, but I say unto you. Verse 34, but I say unto you. Verse 39, but I say unto you. Verse 44, but I say unto you, love your enemies. So we see in each of these, Christ is expanding upon the commandment. He's not contradicting the commandment in any way, but he is correcting misconceptions of the day, of his day, that was fostered by the scribes and the Pharisees, or religious society. And religious society today has many misconceptions. So he's correcting these misconceptions, but he's also further explaining the law, God's rules. And the life we are called to live is not separate and apart from God's law. It's not separate and apart from the rules of God. There are many today who profess salvation, who teach that the Old Testament was rules, Christ did away with the rules. No, nothing could be further from the truth. You cannot live the life that God has called you to live separate and apart from God's rules, separate and apart from God's ways. But there are an awful lot of people today that they don't want rules. Well, then you cannot live this life that we're called to live. So I want to consider tonight the significance of the law to the life that we are called to live. Think about God's laws. They are His rules of conduct. God has rules. God has rules of conduct. God's laws are His appointments. They are His sanctions. They are His orders. His boundaries. It's God setting boundaries for His people, but for all society. If God's boundaries are followed, society is sane. Society works. You start tearing down those boundaries, and you have an insane society. You have a world that's gone crazy. The laws of God speak of His authority. The life that we are called to live is under the authority of God. His laws speak of His government. It's under the government of God. Now, society and culture, and I'm not just talking about our society and culture, but society and culture in general, are marked by the process of secularization. What is that? Well, secularization is the process of separating from the Lord. The process of separating from His Word. And it is a process, and you can see it through our lifetimes. There's this process of secularization. It's nothing new. It's been going on a long, long, long time. It is the process of moving toward acceptance and tolerance of what is condemned by God. Now, society today thinks that's a great advancement. We're more intellectual. We're smarter. So we've learned. No. It's a process of removing God. Removing God's boundaries. This secularization leads to humanism, which is the religion of self. It leads to pluralism, which says one idea or thought is just as valid as another. That can't be so. How can error be just as valid as truth? But that's what secularization does. It leads to pluralism. You've removed the standard. It also leads to relativism. That is, truth and morality are determined in relation to culture, in relation to the times, in relation to society, in relation to circumstances. The result of all this is a society and culture that says there is no absolute truth. Who can say what is right or what is wrong? Who can say what is truth? There is no absolute authority to determine what is true, what is right, what is wrong. Those things are determined by people. Those things are determined by society, culture, times, whatever. The result of all of that is every individual becomes their own authority. It's what you have in Judges 21:25. There was no king, or there was no authority, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Man becomes his own society, his own standard. What that results in is an amoral society. I didn't say immoral. Amoral is worse than immoral. It's an advance of an immoral society. An amoral society is where biblical absolutes are done away with. People do that which is right in their own eyes, and depraved man becomes his own standard. Society has a problem when depraved man becomes his own standard. But the laws of God say differently. The laws of God go against all of this which we've just said. The entire system of God's law declares there is truth. There is truth. And if there is truth, then there has to be error, because whatever is contrary to truth is error. There is truth. There is authority. And God is the authority. And there are rules. Well, I don't like rules. No, depraved man doesn't. But there is truth, and God has already declared it, and God is the authority behind it, and there are rules. And there is a judge. There is a judge. And there's accountability. This is what the laws of God declare. There is truth. There is authority. There are rules. There is a judge. And there is accountability. So these fundamental truths must be remembered throughout our life. And they play a very significant role in our lives. And they play a very significant role in the life that we are called to live. Now, the significance and importance of God's law is seen from several facts. people were to know the law of God. Notice in Exodus chapter 18. Exodus chapter 18. Verse 16. Exodus 18, verse 16. When they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of God and His laws. Man needs to know God's laws. Man needs to know the statutes of God. That shows that they're important. Now notice in verse 20. And thou shalt teach them ordinances and laws, and shall show them the way wherein they must walk. It's not that they should, but they must. And the work that they must do. So we see the importance of God's laws by the fact that the people were to know them. They were to know them. People were to take those laws and then they were to store them in their hearts. Over in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. And verse 6. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. They need to find a lodging place in the heart. We see also that the people were to teach the commands of God to their children. Verse 7. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house. It should be a topic of conversation. And when thou walkest in the way, it should be a topic of conversation. And when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. So the people were to know the laws of God. They were to find lodging in their hearts. They were to teach them diligently to their children. And they were to have the laws of God constantly before them. Notice verse 8 and verse 9. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes, and thou shalt write them upon the post of thy house and on thy gates. They were to keep the laws of God before them constantly. We see that they were to be publicly read. Notice in Deuteronomy 31. Deuteronomy 31. In verse 11. When all Israel is come to appear before the Lord thy God in the place which He shall choose, thou shalt read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men and women and children, and thy stranger that is within thy gates, that they may hear, and that they may learn, and fear the Lord your God, and observe to do all the words of this law, and that their children which have not known anything, that's infants, may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as ye live in this land, whither ye go over Jordan to possess it. Now the book of Deuteronomy, of course, is second law. That's what Deuteronomy means, second law. It's a repeat. It's God repeating all of His laws. It's a repetition. All of this shows the significance, the importance of God's laws. Then in Malachi 4:4, we see the laws of God were to be remembered. They were to be remembered. So every law that God gave every commandment, every prohibition that He issued, whether it was under moral law, civil law, or ceremonial law, it was a proclamation, an affirmation of truth. It was God saying, this is how I want it done. This is how. So, these truths are essential to living the life we're called to live. You can't just do it your way. It has to be done God's way. It's not obedience unless it's God's way. It has to be God's way. God's laws proclaim many things. They proclaim the truth, they proclaim truths, I should say, about God. They, regardless of the law, every one of them, thus saith the Lord, I give you this commandment. However it's phrased, doesn't matter. They all declare the absolute authority of God. And the life that we're called to live is to be lived under the absolute authority of God. His authority speaks of His person. It speaks of His dominance. It speaks of His rule. It speaks of His right to command whatever He pleases. That's God's right. What right do you and I have? Well, I think. Who gave you that right? It's God's right. Well, I don't agree. It's God's right to command whatever He pleases. The laws of God are a declaration that God has standards. God has standards. And those standards are very precise. Those standards are very definite. And that perhaps is best seen in the ceremonial law, where very definite specifics were laid down concerning the offerings, concerning the priests who ministered at the altar of God. These were all very definite laws. There were very definite laws concerning feast days, daily offerings, Sabbath offerings, yearly offerings. All of those laws. You say, well, Christ fulfilled the types of those laws. Yes, He did. But why was God so precise? Why was God so definite? There's a lesson there. And I believe the lesson is it matters to God. It matters to God how things are done. Because, well, it doesn't matter. Oh, it does matter. It matters to God, and every single law of God declares that fact. It matters to God how things are done. It matters to God how life is lived. So, the laws declare truths about God. And we need to remember those truths as we strive to live the life that God has called us to live. God's laws also proclaim truths about man. The laws of God are a proclamation of man's depravity. Why would you have to tell man, thou shalt not commit adultery? Thou shalt not kill. Why would you have to tell him that? Because he's going to. So it's a proclamation of the depravity of man. It's a proclamation of the need of man. The fact that man has to be told to love God speaks volumes of man's nature. Speaks volumes of his depravity. We need to keep that in mind as we strive to live for Him, we need to keep in mind our depravity. Because of the depravity of man's nature, because of his sinful inclination, because of his proneness to wander, man needed boundaries, or he'd completely destroy himself. He needed some confines for his own protection, for his own well-being. And that's what these rules are for. It's for man's own protection. And we see that through the decades, through the centuries. As God's laws are being discarded, society is in ruins. They're removing that which is meant for the well-being of mankind. The very fact that man needs to be reminded to obey God is a manifestation and a constant reminder of his depravity. The laws of God are a proclamation that man is both responsible and he is accountable. Also, again, considering truths concerning God's laws, the consequences of breaking His laws proclaim the seriousness of His laws. This is clearly seen in the punishments that were to be inflicted for disobedience to His laws. People were stoned to death for blasphemy. Well, that's the Old Testament. Yes, it is. But what's that tell you? It tells you the seriousness of blasphemy. They were stoned to death. Sabbath breaking. Oh, that's the Old Testament. It shows us they were stoned to death for that as well. It shows the seriousness of God's laws. God's people need to take God's laws seriously. Idolatry. People were put to death. Adultery. Fornication. The disrespect of parents. Or disrespect to parents. All of this shows the seriousness and the gravity of the laws of God. Well, we don't put people to death today for that. No, we don't. Nor are we supposed to. But it makes a statement. This is serious stuff. When God says do it this way, that's serious business. You're not to do it any other way. And the consequences of breaking the laws throughout the Old Testament proclaim the seriousness of God's laws. Again, the laws of God are a proclamation of His standards. God is precise. God is definite. God is particular. That is seen in the creation and the government of creation. Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9 declares that. It's God's rules is why we have night and day. That's God's rules. Creation follows God's rules. It's why it rains and it's why it stops raining. God's rules. All of creation, you see, is God's rules. And when it comes to mankind, God has a standard. He has set the standard. Society is not the standard. The church is not the standard. God has already set the standard. And that God's standard, of course, is revealed and declared in His laws. Well, I don't know what God wants me to do. That's what people will say all the time. Well, I think you do. Because it's not that hard to figure out. I think you do know. But you don't like what you know. Is what it boils down to many times. God's rules are pretty plain. They really are. Not hard to understand. And they're revealed and declared in His laws. And in the laws of God, particulars and very definite specifics are very clearly established. God's laws declare it matters to God how things are done. The variety. We could spend a lot of time on this. We won't. The variety of God's laws proclaim that they were all encompassing. There wasn't anything that God didn't have a rule for. Not a thing. Everything. There were laws regarding every aspect of worship. Every aspect of it. This is how you do it, God says. Man says, no, I don't agree with that. I'll do it my way. Well, it's not worship then. Plain and simple. That's why worship hardly ever takes place, if it ever does. Because man wants to do it his way. And God's way is very specific about worship. Laws regarding family life. Very specific. Very clear. Very definite. Laws regarding marriage. Very clear. Well, it's 2025. Yes, it is. God's laws haven't changed. Laws regarding divorce. Well, I don't agree. Well, you don't have the right to disagree. God has the right to declare. And He has. There are laws regarding parenting children. Or rules, I should say. There are rules concerning relationships between husbands and wives. There were laws regarding labor. Employers and employees. This is how it's to be done, God says. There were laws regarding money and property. Uncontrolled oxen. Uncontrolled dog, an uncontrolled cat, whatever. The owners of those were responsible. There were laws concerning property and trust, inheritances, and landmarks. When at home church we had a dispute. Well, it wasn't a dispute. We had a problem with the next door neighbor. He was always parking his vehicles on church property. And went and talked to him many times. And we finally told him we're going to put up a fence. Because you can't keep doing this. So we did. And before the fence was put up, of course, the surveyors come out and they staked it all out. And I drove by one day and there he was out there with a shovel. And I said, what are you doing? Well, I'm moving this. I said, you can't move that. Well, I don't like where it is. And that's exactly right. And that's what God's people do. Well, we'll just remove it. I don't like where it is. I want it over here. It doesn't matter where you want it. This is where it is. And God had rules, landmarks. He even had rules concerning fruit-bearing trees. You say, well, what does it matter? It matters to God. And that's what the laws of God declare. It matters. It matters to God. There were laws concerning the building of houses. Notice in Deuteronomy chapter 22. In Deuteronomy 22, there are many laws stated here, and people will go through and pick and choose. But again, all these laws are saying is, God has authority in everything. Deuteronomy 22, verse 8. When thou buildest a new house, then shalt thou make a battlement for thy roof. That is, you put a railing up. That thou bring not blood upon thine house if any man fall from thence. So you build a house, you do it with safety in mind. That was a rule. That was God's rule. There were laws, rules concerning gardening. Well, what difference does it make? Matters to God. That's what these laws are declaring. Deuteronomy 22, verse 9. Thou shalt not sow thy vineyard with divers seeds. Thou shalt not use divers seeds. Lest the fruit of thy seed which thou hast sown and the fruit of thy vineyard be defiled. Now I believe there's another lesson there. He's teaching Israel to be separate. And he's illustrating this through these rules for the garden. But again, I say, it matters to God. You may not think it matters, but it matters. It matters to God. And that has to be always in our mind if we're going to live the life that God has called us to live. Rules concerning clothing. Deuteronomy 22:5, the woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are an abomination unto the Lord. Verse 11, thou shalt not wear a garment of divers sorts, as of woolen and linen together. You know, what difference does it make? Mattered to God. Mattered to God. So, all these laws declare that God's rules, God's authority is all-encompassing. There were laws regarding business. There was to be no interest on loans to God's people. You lend a family member money, you don't charge interest. That was against the law of God. There was no bribes, no oppression. There were laws regarding animals. There were laws regarding neighbors. There were laws regarding health. And there were dietary laws. Leviticus 11, there are numerous laws concerning clean and unclean. The point is that God's laws covered and reached into every aspect of life. That's my whole point. God's rules reached into every aspect of life. Nothing was off limits to God's rule, to God's authority. And we must keep that in mind, striving to live the life He's called us to live. God's ways reach into every aspect of our life. You don't put up fences to keep God out. There's nothing in my life, there's nothing in your life that God is not concerned with. that God's rules do not enter into. So it reaches into every aspect of life. What that tells us is that we're called to live every aspect of our lives in obedience to the revealed will of God. The laws of God remind us that God has authority in every area of our life. God's government is to be in every area of our life. God has a claim in every area of our life. I don't care what it is. God has a claim in every single area of our life. The truth is, we will not live the life that we're supposed to live until we realize that. God has claimed. Well, it's my life. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. It reminds us that God's boundaries are in every area of our life. It'd be wise to observe God's boundaries, to take heed of God's boundaries. God has standards in every area of our life. God has right in every area of our life. God has rights, again, in all of our life. He has jurisdiction in every area of our life. We are responsible to God in every aspect, in every area of our life, and accountable. All of this serves to remind us of the seriousness of life. God has something to say about everything. And in everything it matters. It ought to concern us in everything we do, in every aspect of our life. What does God want? What does God want? And that's really all that matters. That's all that really matters. So in these laws, we are being taught to be mindful of God in all things. And as we live the Sermon on the Mount life, we're to be mindful of God in all things. The laws of God are telling us to acknowledge God and His way in all things, because it matters to God. It matters to God. The principles, the teachings, the proclamation of God's laws carry over into the life that is presented and illustrated in the Sermon on the Mount. So again, this section goes through the end of chapter 5. It's a large section on the Sermon on the Mount. Again, showing its importance. Showing the importance of the rules, the regulations of God, the specifics of God. You look at the directions, the instructions to build the tabernacle. Everything was very, very, very precise. Close enough did not work. Do the best you can. Sorry, that doesn't cut it. It has to be God's way. That needs to sink into our hearts and into our minds. It has to be God's way. And God's way is the best way. And God's way is what is best for you and I. Whether we understand it or not doesn't matter. Just do it God's way. Just do it God's way. And everything works when it's done God's way. Everything runs smooth when it's done God's way. Again, creation is a good example. Creation follows the rules of God. And when it doesn't, that's because God allows the waters to cross their boundaries. Then what do you have? You have floods. You have chaos. You have disaster. You have ruin. That's what happens when God's boundaries are crossed. So we need to remember this as we strive to live the life that He's called us to live. Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us